right, let's return to our focus on strike action today. The Public Servants Association, representing more than 230,000 members, went on strike today. We just spoke to the PSA spokesperson saying that it did indeed have a big impact affecting Home Affairs, affecting one of the borders. And what they've done is given government 7 days to respond to their list of demands. So one includes a salary increase of 10%, although the PSA has said it's willing to settle on 6.5%. Government, you'll recall, has budgeted for 3% and says that is what it can afford. It's not undermining collective bargaining. Well, let's look at this question. Can government afford to give more? We're joined by Economist and founding director at Nascence Advisory and Research, Xhanti Payi. Xhanti, great to chat to you as always. When the finance minister, announced 3%, what do you think was going through his mind? Because he must have known it would spark some sort of action. The unions would not be able to just sit down.
No, that's absolutely true, and good evening to you. I think the main thing here is that, of course, it's looking at the longer-term picture, right? I mean, it's one thing to put in the money now that's being demanded. But remember, we already had a very high base. So when people talk about the base in terms of what we are paying in public sector wages or in public sector emoluments, we are already at that higher level where we actually spend over about a third of all our spending goes into that. So now if somebody thinks about it in maybe simple terms, if you earn 200 Rand and then you add 10% to that, that takes you maybe 220 Rand. That's about 20 Rand, but the next 10% is not just 20 Rand, it's about 22 Rand. So you start to actually having then to raise 22 Rand instead of actually having raised 20 Rand to be able to pay that. So I think the concern is really at the level where you think if I add 10% now, next year, and that actually takes me to 20 Rand increase, the next increase is going to be 22 Rand, and how do I raise that? And of course, we know that our economic situation and our economic growth situation is not at the level where we can afford that. So perhaps even if we look at the situation today and so we could, I think the big concern is how do we sustain this going forward? Yeah. So I think that's really the big problem. It's about how to sustain this thing going forward.
However, if all the public sector unions stand together, there could be a huge economic impact if a full-blown strike goes ahead. So government looking at that prospect, would it have been thinking, oh, well, maybe we'll come up with something, maybe a 4% or something like that in future? Or do you think the 3% is hard and fast and will be no matter what?
You know what I think is the real problem, and I think we always wait for these moments where there's actually a crisis. Now, one of the things that we know is certainly that we need to rationalize this. We've been talking about reforming the economy, reforming the public sector wages, but we really haven't gone there. I was listening to the budget, I was reading the budget, and one of the things that emerges there is that we get this claim that government has taken it down from about the total consolidated expenditure in public wages from 34.5% to about 31%. But what we need to do is to actually go deeper than that, to rationalize it in a manner that actually we know that we can sustain it. So basically we change the very base of it. In government, one of the things we find is that, at a national level, you get a certain grading. So it doesn't matter whether you actually are a scientist or you are, an engineer, or you may be any kind of, as long as you are at a certain grading, that's how much you get paid. So that value, that skill is paid similarly, no matter how skilled you are and no matter how demanded you are. And I think the problem is that we might have to actually readjust that to say there may be somebody, for example, who's a DG at finance, may not be earning the same perhaps as the DG at science and technology, which may not be the same skill as a DG at perhaps at arts and culture. And how do we make sure that we scale that properly so that the base itself is not so high? And I think that's something that is some serious work that has to be done, because we are going to be here year in and year out where people are complaining. So, and then of course we also know that in municipalities, for example, if you are in a metro, it doesn't matter whether you are in Gauteng in a metro or you may be in Cape Town, where it's not the same kinds of challenges we are dealing with. So we need to actually rationalize in such a manner that we actually drive the base in such a way that we can actually afford to pay people for the skills that they deliver and for the addition of the value that we get. And that might give us a better outcome in terms of what we are able to spend. So the point I'm making, for example, is that if you are, for example, in Gauteng, and you can deliver, for example, those revenues, then you can be paid a little bit more in terms of the revenues that you can deliver, as opposed to somebody who may not be able to deliver the same thing. Then we would not be so worried about this issue of sustainability.
So I think you are touching on a hot potato that government hasn't really wanted to hold, because, you know, they two sides to the spectrum. An earlier analyst said, well, we didn't really notice the impact of the strike because of inefficiency. But there's a lot of public sympathy with people who perhaps should earn a lot more if they're dealing with children, if they're in healthcare. You want those people to be rewarded, and you want them to care about their careers. So you're talking about a rationalization. Is there a sense that there has to be restructuring, which would mean layoffs, mass layoffs in the public sector? It seems like that has been politically impossible until now. Could we be moving towards that?
I don't think we even need to go to layoffs, because there are some places, for example, that are very understaffed. You know, we always hear that, you know, there are hospitals, for example, who don't have people. We always hear that there are, you know, there are police stations where you can walk in and get your, you know, your case registered and walk out within a few minutes. So we do know that there are some of those things that are already happening in the system. So what is important really is to look deeper into the kind of structure that the government has created and see, I think the word you use as rationalizing is a very important word. And then, of course, I think, as I was saying earlier, again, the skills that people are bringing. So I think one of the things that government has tempered with, I think you'll remember in the years of Minister Tito Mboweni, he used to talk about letting, you know, people, for example, retire and then not replacing them, so that you could maybe bring in more younger people, or you can bring in more skilled people. But that's not enough. You're going to have tough conversations with people in different geographies. I mean, we're already having some people, for example, being paid to work in rural areas, because we know that few skills go there. So those are the kind of discussions that are important, because then you are able to say, you know, there's a certain person who is adding a particular kind of value and being paid a lot more money. I mean, I think the years of state capture, if they've taught us one thing, is that there are certainly people who are sitting in the public sector earning more than they should be earning, or delivering less value than they should be delivering. And those kinds of things are important, because if we want this to be sustainable, we've got to say, how do we make sure? Because that's the big worry, really, is that we can't sustain this bill. And so how do we make sure we sustain it? And the only way to sustain the bill is that each person delivers the kind of value that takes us forward, so that we can think about that person is able to actually sustain their contribution. If you're in a municipality, for example, it's important, we know, if you earn a certain amount in a municipality, are you the kind of skill that's going to bring in investment into that municipality, the kind of revenue into that municipality, so that the municipality itself is not paying someone just because they are a certain grade, but because that person is actually of the skill and the quality and the contribution that makes it possible for them then for us to be comfortable that if we raise it by 20% or by 10%, we will be able next year to sustain that extra 2 rand, that extra 200, that extra 2,000 rand. So that's really the discussion we should be having. But as you say, it's something that the work that we are very afraid to do. It's a hot potato, because then you are now touching certain areas where people, obviously, you know, accountability is not a particularly strong point in South Africa.
All right, thank you very much. Xhanti Payi, economist and director at Nascence Advisory and Research.